Tony Fekete is an Englishman of Hungarian descent and an accomplished book collector slash bibliophile.
I suppose you can call me a bibliophile, but bibliophile conjures up images of people who collect fine bindings and limited editions on fine paper. That comes into it, particularly if the bindings maybe have an erotic element or something to them. But I'm not driven by that. I have a friend in Lyon called Jean Bloch, who is definitely in first place a bibliophile, because he won't have anything in his collection that is not of absolute perfect quality. And he doesn't just collect erotica, although he does collect erotica, but he has many other interests as well. And the person that I bought a huge chunk of my collection from, part of which was sold, Karl Ludwig Leonhard, in Hamburg, was, I suppose, a bibliophile in the sense that he loved books. And he collected everything, even those that are not in good condition, because of the text. If a text was rare, he was less concerned about the condition. So he was less interested in the books from a physical point of view. He was absolutely obsessed in collecting everything that had something to do with erotica. And he had a huge collection, and I bought most of it in about 2007, after he died.
So you travel constantly in pursuit of books, and you have a background in banking.
Correct. I still work in financial services. I'm going to South Africa this weekend to do some work with a bank there. But I also, whenever I travel, I look for things.
Yes. Well, here's a quote for you from Walter Benjamin. How many cities have revealed themselves to me in the marches I undertook in the pursuit of books?
That's absolutely right. Collecting books, looking for anything, because I look for more than just books, is a way of exploring a city as well and getting to know people there. I have a very good friend, he's now a business partner as well, that I met in Chisinau in the Republic of Moldova. And I visit him regularly. We see each other in Bucharest. But my relationship with him, because of the books, creates a life for me in these cities, apart from the other things I may be doing there.
It's part of belonging, isn't it, I think?
It's part of getting under the skin, under the surface of the city. Because particularly he's a very down-to-earth person. He finds things for me. And sometimes we go and meet the sellers. And they're very much local curiosities. So that's all part of the fun. Or I travel to Georgia as well to pick up books. They come from various places, but there's somebody who collects for me there. I then get permission to take them out of the country. But again, that gives me an excuse to go to Georgia. And I always have these meetings with the suppliers. It makes it all very exciting.
Yeah, couldn't agree with you more. I've seen all sorts of places that I would never have seen if I hadn't been, as Benjamin says, hunting down a book or a bookstore. Just to put this in context, about a year ago, a bookseller mentioned to me that erotica was a really interesting collecting area. And so I bought a few things off him. And I did a bit of research and came across your catalog of erotica from 2014. Perhaps you could tell us how one would go about starting to collect erotica.
Very good question. How do you go about starting anything? Erotica was my second or third collecting area, and now I'm on my fifth. And you learn a lot through the process of collecting particular areas. I mean, if it's the first thing that you're collecting, the danger is that people, of course, are going to sell you stuff that they haven't been able to sell for a few years. And certainly, even in the exotic area of erotica, there are things that don't sell very well, or that don't sell at the price that people would like to see them sell at.
Like what?
Like beautiful illustrated books from the 1930s, very explicit, but some of those illustrated by Collot or Becquin, they're French artists, illustrators, quite difficult to sell at a good price anymore.
Why is that?
Two reasons. One, there are fewer collectors of erotica, so there are fewer buyers of the more common stuff, and those collectors who are still there have them already, so the market is much thinner. And secondly, they're not as rare as one thought that they would be, or that they were. The French books from the 1920s and 30s have a strong bibliophile quality to them. They were limited editions. They were usually on fine paper or different papers on Japon, on Velin, on various different types of paper, and they were produced for collectors. And these didn't disappear. The things that disappear are things that were maybe commercially produced or produced in a very, very limited number, and they weren't produced for a collecting audience. I mean, you have to think, for example, we see these in other areas of like classical literature. You have this Folio Press in the UK or the Franklin Press in the US. Limited editions of 10,000 numbers and bound in plastic or over-decorated leather. And there are people who collect them, and there is a market. You have to think that some of the erotica was definitely much more, was much finer, and some of it's very beautiful, but it's not scarce, and there are not enough new collectors, which means what's still strong is very rare stuff. But the rare stuff doesn't come to the market that much.
Sounds like a buying opportunity.
Well, it does, if you believe that the interest in erotica is going to increase again in the future.
I'm just going to give you one more quote. I'm guessing that this might have something to do with why you were interested in collecting it. It's the first sentence in Taschen's book, Erotica Universalis.
Okay.
And the sentence is, there is only one real antidote to the anguish engendered in humanity by its awareness of inevitable death, erotic joy. Is that why you collect it?
Not really. Of course, you see, that's a philosophical statement. I don't know whom he's quoting there. Was that a quotation from somebody?
No, it wasn't. It's nicely phrased. The author is Gilles Néret.
Yeah, and Gilles Néret, who did quite a lot of popular books on erotica. What he's saying is fine, but if you look back at the erotica in this Erotica Universalis, you'll see very little of it is actually stimulating. It's either comic, caricature, or very critical. And it's important to know that early erotica, if you look at stuff from even in the 16th century, although it was quite rare then, going through the 17th century, 18th century gets very strong, and up to the middle of the 19th century, very little erotica was produced just for stimulation purposes. So what he's saying that, these things enhance erotic feelings, that's not true. I mean, if you look at the 18th century books, for example, a predominant theme, well, there were two predominant themes there. One was anti-clericalism, because you see priests very often and nuns in action.
Hypocrisy.
It was hypocrisy and the decadence of the aristocracy as well. So it was either effete aristocrats or it was nuns and priests at play, but they were not presented if you look at the engravings from the 18th century, they weren't particularly stimulating sexually in any way. They weren't caricatures. They were artistically presented in a very factual way, not in like a cartoon or a caricature. But the message was a caricature. It was satire. A lot of the 18th century erotica is satire, and you don't really see the emergence of. I mean, it did exist beforehand, but erotica in what we would call a pornographic sense didn't really emerge until maybe around the middle of the 19th century, where it became popularized and it was made for a bourgeois audience, and their sexual stimulation was very much of the order. There are very few of these books from a textual point of view that are of quality. There are some, indeed, there are some, but most of them were very much done for stimulation purposes, and they presented fantasy situations in, for example, Victorian England or in France or something like that. And there you see the emergence of mass erotica in French, in German, and in English.
It's photographs, which are reality. They're much more stimulating. Yes.
Yes, those that were produced. I mean, it's interesting with the development of photography. You found nudes appearing very quickly. So from the 1840s onwards, you'll find nude pictures, and some of them are artistic because the trend with photography was to present it as an alternative to a painting. Very often they were very posed, the photographs. But then you do also have in the 19th century extremely pornographic pictures with copulation, and usually they're of smaller size so that people could carry them around with them, put them in albums that were hidden away. But these pictures served exactly the same purposes. They're cousins of today, or of the up to a few years ago before the internet, exactly the same purpose. And, it became obvious to anybody who was commercially minded that there would be a market for erotic literature of low quality, literary quality, and also erotic photographs.
Well, the stat that I've seen is that this is a bit further on. There was, first of all, picture postcards came in around 1870. And then from 1919 to 1939 in France, 20 million of them were published.
Mm-hmm. I mean, what you find even in the earlier period were that there were purveyors of these photographs. They made catalogs, and the catalogs were very often like contact prints of the postcards with a number on them. So very often in the earlier postcards, right into the 30s, you'll see a little number in the right-hand corner, and that was the order number. And you could see the catalogs were not in book form, but sometimes they were a large photograph with very small miniature versions of the various postcards or photographs that had been made. So there was definitely a good business in pornography emerging at the end of the not last century now, 19th century.
Yeah. So why'd you get into it then?
I got into it by chance. I had a mentor, Hans-Jürgen Depp, who's quite a prolific writer about erotica. He does large illustrated coffee table books, but he also has a good, if you like, psychological and philosophical element to them because he studied psychology, and he takes, if you like, an intellectual approach to it as well. I met him in a bookshop in Frankfurt, not far from where he was living. This was in 1990. And then we started talking, and he told me that he was a collector of erotica. And anyway, I then went to see him in his at home, and he showed me his collection. Because first of all, he came to me and I said, aha, I have erotica. And he came to see me and he said, well, these books that you have are not erotica, because they were sort of from 1900 and they had sort of artistic nudes in them. And he said, come round and I'll show you what erotica really is. So I went round there and he showed me, these were mainly books from up to about 1940, the sort of books that we were talking about just now that have not seen strong market prices. But I started with those and he sold them to me.
But and again, were you titillated? Like, what was it?
No, I just thought they were just completely unusual. I found the content interesting. I liked it. I liked the provocative language because I like provocation. I like challenging authority, if you like. And what I liked about these were that some of them were successful. I mean, some of them were stimulating and erotic, but mostly it was just this disregard for taboos, openness, challenging authority, being privately produced, and very often of excellent quality. So this is, these were clandestine productions, but very, very often of very, very high quality. So these were people who had money who bought them. They were not cheap things. Of course, there were the cheap elements as well, and I bought those because my collection was very wide. And the collection I bought from Carl Ludwig Leonhard, he was omnivorous as far as buying. He bought anything that had something to do with erotica. And
Right.
he even was buying contemporary erotic magazines in the 1970s and 80s. And you can see the sexual revolution of the time is very well documented in his collection as well. I mean, starting, as we sometimes forget, in Sweden and Denmark, which are today rather conservative societies, or they look at at things a bit differently, and certainly not in a revolutionary way that they did then. So he has all of these, which I still have, I haven't sold. And he had some of the great classics as well. He had absolutely everything. So that's what fascinated me, the rarity, the scarcity of the books, the openness, and I enjoyed reading them. When I say enjoyed reading them as well, you have to remember that maybe 95% of erotic literature, when you're looking at literature, is uninteresting, badly written, and repetitive. In the 1960s and 70s, when you had Olympia Press, for example, the model, and also these American pulp novels that were produced during the 60s, and they became completely open at the end of the 60s, they were written on the basis of somebody was given a title. It can be My Best Friend's Mom or something, or Teacher's Pet, or even Nazi concentration camp fantasy. They were given a title and they were told to write 144 pages around the title. So you're not going to get any great works of literature from that. But sometimes some really, really good books come through. They're actually great to read because they're stimulating from every point of view. They're stimulating because they succeed in creating an erotic atmosphere, and they convey the spirit of erotica, what they're trying to describe. And they're also interesting because they are psychological investigations.
Yeah.
There was, I've forgotten his initial, I think it's C.V. Vanek, Olympia Press, The Skin Game, very, very good book that appeared around 1970, which is about sadomasochism, and it really goes into the psychology of role players who enjoy that. And when I read that book for the first time, I understood what motivated people. I think it could be C.S. Vanek, The Skin Game, a brilliant book. There are some French books from the late 40s or last half of the 40s into the 50s, early 60s, that are actually great works of literature, like the story of O, another one by Alain Berg, which is called, that's his pseudonym, L'Image, The Image, which is one of my favorite, absolutely favorite erotic books. It's about a relationship between a lesbian woman and a very young girl, she must be about 16 or 17, that she controls, and a man. And the man is a sort of outsider to the triangle, but the atmosphere of the book is tremendous. And there's another one called La vie d'une prostituée, The Life of a Prostitute by Thérèse, also from this period. Brilliant. They're absolutely brilliant books.
Would you include Liaison Dangereuse in your collection or not?
No, I didn't buy it because you have to understand that's a great work of literature. It could be in the collection because it certainly covers the subject, but you have to draw the line somewhere because there's a lot of sexual innuendo in books without being explicit.
Wait a minute. Explicit is the line?
Explicit is the line, yeah. Because my friend Hans-Jürgen Döpp, who was my mentor, explained to me very clearly that there is a difference. In French, they say galant or libre. Galant is galant. That means it's full of innuendo, even if the innuendo is very advanced and clear what they're talking about. Yeah. But libre is no holds barred. It describes everything. It describes the sexual act in detail. For me, that was the dividing line. However, in some cases, there is an exception to that. That is, for example, in homosexual books. What you find in homosexual literature is quite interesting, that the relationship between people, the characters in the books, are sometimes, certainly in the early 20th century, were defined by their actions towards each other, which had nothing to do with sex directly. I mean, I always give the example of The Well of Loneliness by Radcliffe Hall. It's a great book. I did have a copy in my collection. There's nothing erotic in the sense of libre in it. There are no sweaty scenes of women having sex with each other. But the erotica in it, the challenge within the book, because it challenges values, is that they would say, for example, Jane and Janet came through the door holding hands, looking into each other's eyes. Now, if you put that also in a male context, that would be more powerful. If you said Joe and Frank walked into the sitting room holding hands and looking into each other's eyes, right, that would be considered a gay novel or a gay statement. You could therefore, just because the society was so sensitive to the issue, you could call a book that was purely based on innuendo and description of the way people looked at each other, you could put it in the erotic category, or certainly I considered it to be in the collectible category. Because, I mean, the area of homosexual literature is much broader. Again, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, you had the pulp fiction that you had in the other areas as well. But before then, a lot of it was very literary, very descriptive, and certainly not explicit.
No, you'd get arrested. You would get thrown in jail, right?
Yes. Well, you would for explicit heterosexual novels as well. What you found in the early 20th century and the end of the 18th century, 19th century, was schoolmasters and priests writing poems in praise of young boys. They were called the Uranians, the Uranian poets. I have a few books, or had a few books of a Uranian character, but I think that they have a legitimate place in an erotic library as well.
What about the Lady Chatterley's lover decision that came down in the early 60s? Did that open the floodgates? And is that a big turning point for your collection?
Well, I wouldn't say a turning point for my collection, because the things I bought myself were usually much earlier than the 1960s. Carl Ludwig Leonhardt, from whom I bought his collection, bought everything. I mean, he bought stuff that was currently available. He had catalogs from erotic film dealers. He had everything that you could imagine that documented erotica of the time. So you could say that from his perspective, it was important because it opened the floodgates, and slowly you found slowly and with trepidation. There wasn't the decision and the next day the market was flooded. Still, there was a lot of under-the-counter stuff in Soho in London, or you had the mafia, as you know, in the US, managing a lot of the pornographic stuff that was produced there. And in Europe, you may remember the beginnings of this were very much sex education films with explicit demonstrations of positions, normally with white-coated Swedish or Danish doctors presiding over the events. And then you quickly got away from this pretense with the doctors in white coats. And then by the 1970s, things got serious. And like in many revolutions, there were no limits. I mean, in the 1970s. Yes. So then the debate started, and I'm surprised because I see these things in Carl Ludwig's collection. Even into the 80s, you had things that were printed for sale, which would be banned today.
Like what?
Underage girls, for example. There were magazines in even into the early 80s. Yeah. I don't have these, of course, in my collection, but they were available at the time. And there was a movement. I mean, there was, if you like, the sexual revolution was politicized to the extent that people believed that, this was an essential freedom that everybody should enjoy, and that there shouldn't be artificial barriers like age or something like that to prevent people from enjoying whatever they wanted to do. So that was the spirit of the 1970s and even the 1980s. The Green Party in Germany had in their manifesto elements which would be considered completely unacceptable today. So
interesting.
You had that. You had that at the time.
Okay, let's look at. I'm referencing an interview you did with Jordan Todorov a couple of years ago.
Yeah, a Bulgarian guy. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right, and what I picked up out of that was some guidelines for a collection, and I'll quickly run through those. Coherency. It has to be coherent. It has to have a message. It has to reflect your character. It has to be complete. And it has to be, this is kind of like coherency, but relevant to the subject and eliminate all inessentials. You want to comment on any of that?
I don't know if I would. If you're quoting it, probably meant that I did say that at the time, but it seems to me to be a bit restrictive. I think that it's good that it represents or reflects the taste and the character of the collector, but that doesn't necessarily mean his sexual interests or sexual preferences. It could mean that the collector has defined the scope of the collection, and I think that's important to define the scope of a collection. I mean, there are some people, of course, in the area of erotica. If they're gay, they collect gay erotica, full stop. I was interested in any form of erotica, as I collected extremely broadly. I think that as a collector, if you collect broadly, you still have to have criteria for collection. That's very important. Unless you do that, you get an amorphous mass of things, which can actually degrade the value and the coherence of the collection. And I do this with everything that I collect as well. And by having collection criteria or questions that you ask yourself before you buy something, you maintain the quality of the collection. I mean, for me, this developed after erotica, but when I was collecting erotica myself without buying from Carl Ludwig, I was concerned that things are in good condition. That was very important, that it be unusual, that there should be something about it that's not commonplace, that I could tell a story about it. And that this is always for my next collection after that, which was even broader, which was about languages and culture. I always ask myself, what story does this book tell? Why should I be buying this book? With erotica, it could be because it's by a well-known artist from the 1930s. It's a rare edition, or it has something. Then it's less controversial or less difficult to decide with erotica. However, in other areas, which can be vast, and you can really, by buying absolutely everything, you can be wasting money and developing a pile of uninteresting stuff. It's very important that you have to know the structure and purpose of your collection. So when people say, what do you collect? You just don't say erotica. You can talk about what is interesting for you and what type of books you're looking for. And that's very important as a collector. I mean, it could be bindings, it could be illustrations, it could be illustration by one artist, it could be one author. Say, I collect Marquis de Sade or something like that.
Yeah, okay. But your collection was quite broad, and one of the lines, as we discussed, was that there's explicit reference to sex.
Yeah, exactly. So that was a criterion. It's very tempting to buy Les Liaisons Dangereuses in the collection, but the question is, does it really fit in to your criterion, which is that it should be libre? Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's why I would say no to a first edition of Liaison Dangereuse.
Understood. Okay. Now you put together a catalog of your collection and you picked 220 of the most interesting items in that collection of about 4,000. Is that right?
The Christie's one, you mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, it was called Highlights of my collection. I had to discipline myself there, and I said, if I'm going to do a sale at Christie's, I have to put in the best things.
So you just sold 200 items? That was it?
Well, it's a good number for a Christie's auction.
Right.
Yeah, because you're looking at, it brought, with commission, it brought £1,200,000, which is quite a lot. And for over 200 items, that's good. And, it wasn't a garage sale.
No.
It was a sale at Christie's of good quality items. I had another auction in Paris just a few years ago, in 2020, I think, which was a Drouot. And that was then of some items that were not in the sale at Christie's or didn't sell there. I had two of them. The first one was really just stuff it was like cleaning out the shelves and stuff like that. That did quite well. I got €90,000, but the next one was more serious, and that was really, now I'm letting go of another 200 items. I still have a lot.
I was going to say, you still have like 3,800 items, yes?
Well, I don't know. I haven't counted them, but of the very, very high quality stuff, I don't have that much.
Yes.
But I still have some stuff which I've held back because I feel that if I sell the last lot, I should still have some items of quality there. This is me talking as a collector. For example, I collected a lot of Eastern European stuff over time. Quite a lot of that I have not sold yet. What I sold in Paris were either things that I had more than one copy of, or I had 10 items that were similar, and I sold 6 of them.
Okay.
So the idea is that I still have a good core of Eastern European items. Some of the top ones, for example, Stiersky's Emily Came to Me in a Dream. You may know that one, living in Prague, which is considered one of the major surrealist erotic books. Now, that book is a long, long, long way from being stimulating. That's surrealism, in other words, going into the erotic mind, the persona. And I had a copy of that, which I believe only was in 30 copies, and it's highly sought after. And I included that.
Where did you find that?
I found that also in the Czech Republic.
Where?
It was a private deal. I bought it from somebody in Bratislava.
Okay.
Not Czech Republic.
So mostly it's bookstores. Is it mostly bookstores? You're not going to find what you want in flea markets, are you? Or do you go there?
You can always find something.
Do you go to flea markets?
But it'll be by luck.
Do you go to flea markets or not?
Yeah.
You do?
But I don't normally find erotica there. I find books for my other collections. For my language collection, I can find some stuff. If the book is in a language that somebody doesn't understand, I bought a very important Flemish journal, important from the point of view of the Flemish cultural awakening in Belgium, at a Berlin flea market for €8.
Wow,
and it's
nice.
an extremely, extremely scarce book, but in a nice binding, and the €8 was for the binding. And earlier in Eastern Europe, I could find good deals in bookshops, but also because I was on television quite often, because I did a couple of exhibitions at the beginning of this century, 2002, 2004. People called the studio afterward and say, hey, we've got some stuff we'd like to sell. Or maybe he'd be interested in looking at them. And I got a few things that way. People, because they knew that I was a collector of erotica, got in touch with me, of course. That's great.
Yes, it pays to advertise what you're doing, doesn't it?
That's
Yeah.
right. And sometimes, I use my Facebook and Instagram pages as well,
Yes.
effectively to try and show people what I collect and
Yeah.
hope that maybe I'll get offers. On my
Yes.
Facebook site, the latest thing that I'm collecting are old passports, which I find particularly fascinating. And I put something on my page, my Facebook page, and I got 3 responses. One of them was a really interesting Albanian passport from 1923 with a visa for Egypt issued by the British consulate in Durazzo, which is on the coast there, Duresh. And so it's important that if you're well known as a collector in a particular field, then you'll also get people coming to you directly with offers as well.
Yes.
So a
Yes.
lot of the stuff that I buy now, it's not in shops. I have my friend in Moldova who looks for books for me. I have a couple of people in Romania. I have people here in Hungary. They know what I'm looking for. What's good is the stuff that I'm looking for, mostly other people are not collecting.
Yes, this is key, isn't it? Is to go
Yeah.
after an area where the ground hasn't been tilled.
Well, the problem, of course, with that is that, you're creating your own area. So you need a bit of courage for that because you're investing often quite a lot of money in these things, because the broader group of collectors have sometimes fairly narrowly defined areas that they're interested in collecting.
Yeah.
We've got 19th century Hungarian literature or anything to do with the revolution of 1848, anything that is a manuscript of a famous character for Hungarian history. I'm talking about the Budapest now, where I am at the moment.
What's the bookstore scene in Budapest like? There's still
Quite
lots
good.
of them?
Yeah,
Yes.
it's quite good. There's still an active body of collectors.
I'm going to go there and hit the
Good.
bookstores.
Excellent. Well, if I'm here, I'll show you around.
That would be really great. I referenced Susan Sontag's The Volcano Lover, her novel, at the top, or at least when we were talking. And I just want to read the very beginning of that book out to you. See if anything resonates with you. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
It is the entrance to a flea market. No charge, admission free, sloppy crowds, vulpine larking. Why enter? What do you expect to see? I'm seeing, I'm checking on what's in the world, what's left, what's discarded, what's no longer cherished, what had to be sacrificed, what someone thought might interest someone else, but it's rubbish. If there, here, it's already being sifted through, but there may be something valuable there. Not valuable exactly, but something I would want to rescue, something that speaks to me, to my longings.
Mm-hmm. I go, for example, in France, there are still good the good flea markets throughout the country. And I remember going to one in Lyon and finding a very interesting pocket dictionary of French Malagasy, which was €7, and it was published in 1926, I think. And what was very interesting in it, it had, and this is what you look for in this type of situation. It had the stamp of an association that was helping French prisoners of war during the Second World War. They were sending books from France to French soldiers in German prisoner of war camps. There was the stamp in the book of the association that was promoting culture in the camps, and also there was the stamp of the camp in which the owner of the book was actually imprisoned. It was stalags. It was a stalag for officers. So you got a book that is quite interesting. I might have bought it anyway, but it has a special story to it. And what the great thing about the flea market, sometimes you can find good books with interesting stories, because for me it's outside erotica, the story is with erotica as well, but the story is a very, very important element. Not just what's the book about, but has the book got something? Where does it come from? Who owned it? Has it got something interesting written inside it? Who is this person whose name you see written here at the front of the book?
Right. And is that because it makes that particular book unique? What's the reason? Why are you so interested in your book having a story?
Well, it differentiates it from a purely material point of view. If you differentiate a book, you can increase its value significantly, so that you can have
When you describe it in your catalog.
Yeah, exactly. Well,
Yeah.
or even just commercially. I mean, I bought a copy of an English translation of Dante's Vita Nuova, published in Florence in 1860, I think it was. And it's a book that's scarce. It's scarce, costs £150, but it belonged to Dante Gabriele Rossetti, and it had his signature in it. And therefore, a book that was normally €150 was several thousand euro because of the strong association.
You still have that book?
Yes.
Okay, I might have a buyer for you.
Yes, okay. Okay, it's in the catalogue. It's in my catalogue.
It's in your new catalogue.
In my new catalogue of my language and culture books.
Yes, I was going to say, just so that listeners know, your new collection, and this catalog is coming out shortly.
Yes.
It's about the movement of ideas between countries. So obviously, an interesting question would be, how faithful is the translation?
That's a good question. So I can give you a good example of that. Ulysses by James Joyce. There was a translation done in Romania in the 1980s. Mm-hmm. But it was very much an expurgated translation. On the 100th anniversary of the publication of Ulysses, 2022, because I think it was published in 1922, there was a completely new translation done, which drew on the original translation, but made no attempts to expurgate the text. So sometimes you do find that it's not just a question of the quality of translation, it's also a question of the politics of translation.
Yes.
Also, with the quality of translation as well, I can give you another very good example from my erotic library. A very, very important Austrian erotic book is called Josephine Mutzenbacher, and it's about the life of a young Viennese prostitute at the turn of the last century. The book came out in 1907 and has been, or 1906, and it was ascribed to Felix Salten. Now, the book, although if you describe the elements in the book, it would be shocking to somebody in 2024 because she starts her sexual activity at a very, very young age. However, for Austrians, that's of secondary importance. The book is important because it's one of the finest examples of Viennese dialect. It's a book that's beautifully written in the Viennese dialect. Now, how do you translate this? I have a number of translations of the book. They're not in my catalogue because these were paperback copies, and I was just looking at it from the Erotica collection perspective and not from the rarity perspective, although the original Josephine Mutzenbacher is in the catalogue because it's an example of Viennese dialect. Mm. But when I was looking at the translations, one thing I found, for example, was that the French translation was absolutely awful because the whole spirit of the book disappeared because it was a literal translation from Viennese into modern French. So there was no argot in it. There was not an attempt to translate it into a colloquial French that reflected the Viennese dialect. Mm-hmm. So the book became completely sterile. There was also an American edition, which was in the pulp fiction category, which was even worse because it had cheap American slang in it. Fine Viennese dialect translated into cheap American slang.
Yeah, so but at least that's colloquial, though.
But it doesn't have the fineness that why it's considered such a great work of Austrian literature is that it really has the Viennese humor. The book is written with a lot of humor, and it describes extremely well working class life in Vienna, in the Viennese slums at the turn of the last century.
Okay, I've got just a handful more questions that I like to end things up with. I'm just starting to do that, incidentally.
Okay.
So, where are the greatest concentration of good bookstores based on your travels?
Very good question, because unfortunately, everyday bookstores disappear. They close. And you know, I used to enjoy going to Brussels because near the Gare Centrale, there was, I think it's called the Rue Saint-Jean. There used to be a number of bookshops there. And then in France, in Paris, in the 16e arrondissement, it was the same.
Yeah.
Most of those have disappeared. So it's very difficult to say. I think in Budapest, you've got a good selection of bookstores. You've got one street that has a number of bookstores in it. Where you
we're talking, of course, we're talking used antiquarian bookstores.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. In London, there are some good ones, but they're also slowly closing around Charing Cross Road.
It's a shell of what it used to be.
It's everywhere a shell of what it used to be, and it's quite tragic.
It is.
It's because you enjoy. You get the catalogs, you can see everything online, but there's nothing better than discovering a bookshop and then going into it. You see these sometimes in France still. We were on holiday a couple of years ago. We were in Provence, and then on the way back, we stopped in Besançon. And there were a couple of bookshops there. I went into one of them and I was just looking for my normal stuff. And I saw on the bookshelf a copy of Barnaby Rudge by Charles Dickens. And it had a leather binding, and it had Barnaby Rudge written on the spine. But there was something about it that made me curious enough to open it. And I opened it, and I found it was the first Russian translation of Barnaby Rudge, from 1883.
Beautiful, bingo!
And I was very, very happy with that.
This is the thing, isn't it? You can never go past a bookstore because you just don't know what might be in it.
Yeah, I mean, there's always a bargain. It won't come every day. Sometimes it'll come once a year, once every 2 years. But I've had some tremendous strokes of luck. I mean, obviously not absolutely huge amounts, but I found books that for €200 that are worth €15,000. And that one was a copy of Thomas Kempis's De Imitatione Christi in Arabic, the first translation from 1666 from the published in Rome by the Organization for the Propagation of the Faith. And it was in Arabic, and it's a very, very sought after book, which I got for a couple of €100 from a guy who was selling books very, very expensively.
So you got one on him then? You got one on him.
I didn't think I got one on him, but obviously he couldn't have been bothered to check this one out. I did, and I felt, after a while, you feel that this is something that's interesting. I've been collecting for decades. You have a certain instinct that develops.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Your favorite cafe at which to decamp and look over your acquisitions?
When you ask me that question, where I look over my acquisitions and I start photographing them and putting them on my Facebook page, that happens sometimes in a restaurant or in a cafe after I've immediately bought something, but that's not a regular occurrence. That happens most often in a hotel room or on a train, because I travel everywhere by train.
Yes.
And sometimes when I've had a particularly successful buying spree and I have a haul with me, I start putting the books in various positions in the railway compartment and taking photographs of them, or I arrange them on the table in my room and start photographing them.
Okay. So favorite cafe? Maybe just leave it at favorite cafe then. Do you have one or no?
Well, I like the movies cafe in Budapest, or going to Fortnum and Mason's in London, which I like. Or I don't really have so much a favorite cafe. I like going to cafes, and but there's no cafe that I can say I associate with my book collecting.
Okay. You mentioned L'Image, was it? That is your
Yes, by Alain Berg. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. There an English translation of that or not?
Yes, there is, but it's you can find it on the internet on 8books. It's called The Image.
It's any good? Is the translation good?
Good. It's a good, very readable, good translation. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay. Favorite work of art?
Favorite work of art. When you say that, the first thing that springs to mind was, I think it was Malevich's Red Square in the Hermitage in
St. Petersburg.
St. Petersburg. When I went there, it's something. It left a very deep impression on me. I mean, there are thousands of other pictures that I like, but when you asked me that question, that was the first one that came in front of me. And why I liked it so much was the texture of the paint on the canvas, because it was an abstract picture, and one thinks of, oh, it's just a red square on a canvas. But then once you look closely at it, you can see it's something that's 120 years old, and that the square has something very deep to it. And you see that because of the patina of the paint on the canvas. Because it was maybe a painting, an abstract painting, done in a traditional way on a white canvas. It was also painted white. It was not presented, it was presented in a very natural way. It was like the idea was primarily the idea. And it wasn't a polished execution. It wasn't like a Dali or something like that.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just talking extremely personally.
No,
I mean, I'm not an art critic, and I just say, you asked me a question, and that was the first image that came to mind.
That's wonderful. That's what I want. And just final question, a favorite piece of music?
First thing that comes to mind, well, there are two things that come to mind, but the very first that came to mind was Erik Satie's Gymnopédie. But thinking more, I love Wagner. I've been to Bayreuth. I love Wagner as well. So
one of my favorites is the Prelude to Lohengrin. I've been listening to that
absolutely
every day.
Yeah. I love that as well.
So Tony, thank you so much. This has been really wonderful. Exactly what I hope to get.
Excellent. I'm happy.
Very good. Tony Fekete is a book collector, bibliophile, Englishman of Hungarian descent, who has a background in banking and loves to travel in pursuit of books. Thanks so much again for your time.
It's a pleasure, a great pleasure. Cheers.